Welcome back to Art Appreciation, everyone. Today, continuing our discussion of basic art elements, we'll be talking about the principles of design. And so, like our last one, we have to cover quite a bit of fairly basic information today. So, bear with me, and we're going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. So, jumping right in. The basic, principles of design are all in reference to the composition of an artwork. And so, composition refers to the arrangement of the visual elements within a two-dimensional work of art or a three-dimensional work of art. But here we can see a nice diagram. This is what's known as the golden ratio, and it's a way that many artists in the past especially used the visual elements in this kind of format to create a very harmonious kind of picture plane. And so the golden ratio is a very, very harmonious set of ratios. It is a ratio of 1 to 1.618, or as we see here, so A and B equals A plus B there. So pretty basic rundown, but we might be able to see a little bit of a similarity there in its breakdown to that painting by Guido Reni of Saint Sebastian that we saw with implied line last time. So here we can see one of the most basic breakdowns of the golden ratio within the two-dimensional picture plane, or in that surface. Now, it's important to note that this is something that's been known since ancient times. The Greeks are very, very well known for using it quite extensively in the proportioning of their temples and other buildings. Here we can see the Parthenon in Greece. The entire thing is laid out according to the golden ratio, not only in the front as we see here, but the entire building itself. So it's something that's been used since ancient times, for a variety of different artworks and art forms. But if we look at it within the context of more recent artwork, a lot of artists use the golden ratio to help create their implied lines within the picture plane. So here we can see Jean-Leon Gérôme's the Eminence Grays, so the gray eminence. And so we can see the breakdown of the space within the picture plane that's oriented to the golden ratio, and these kind of breakdowns are being used as the implied lines within the formal organization of this painting. And so these help to keep our eyes from being solely focused on the dead center or anything like that. So it helps to draw our eyes throughout. And what's interesting is that it's not only based on major thrusting elements such as the figural group that we see here, but it's also small, elements such as the reflection of light that we see coming from the window down here in the bottom corner, which help to anchor and give us a resting place to draw our attention away from the major focal point of the painting itself. So this is a very interesting way to go about creating a composition. But we can do it in much more complicated kinds of ways. And once again, many artists have done this in many different ways. So here we can see Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But we can see how he's using the golden ratio in a much more complicated manner. But it's not just the overall composition that he's utilizing it for, it's also the breakdown of formal elements within the composition. So the spacing between the proportions of the human form and everything like that. So for instance, he's using the golden ratio for the length between Adam's elbow and his fingertip here, which would also be somewhat reminiscent between the distance between his elbow and his shoulder. So it's being used to idealize the human form as well as idealize the overall composition. But it is important to note that we can use this in a myriad of different ways, and artists have used it quite extensively. So here we can see Leonardo da Vinci's The Mona Lisa, but we can see the breakdown of the golden ratio within the proportioning of just the Mona Lisa's face in general, and the relationship between the proportion of her head to her torso and hands and everything like this. So once again, this is a way that many artists have gone about very formally organizing the elements within a composition to create a harmonious whole. Now, aside from the golden ratio, another major compositional element that we can utilize is the triangle. And so here we can see a work that utilizes the triangle quite extensively. And so this is Peter Paul Rubens' Venus and Adonis. So this is a scene from classical Greco-Roman mythology, but we can see that the triangular form is being used to draw our attention up from the bottom to the kind of climactic focal point, which is the kind of kiss that's about to happen between Venus and Adonis. And so Venus, once again, goddess of love and desire and all of that. So we can see Cupid there as well. But once again, it's all leading us up to this point. But we can also see the additional use of triangle to create, once again, in the arm of Adonis, this nice kind of resting point, which draws our attention away from being solely focused on that kind of anticipation between the two lovers there. However, that's kind of a rare example, because most of the time in Western art, especially when the triangle is used, it's usually used for more religious kinds of artwork as opposed to mythological kinds of artwork. And so here we can see an example by Raphael. This is the Madonna del Prado. And, here we can see the triangle being used to create a very solid, stable kind of composition. And so this is meant to echo the kind of stability of the church, if you will, but it's also meant to echo the whole idea of the Holy Trinity, or the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So this is something that's utilized quite extensively in many different Christian religious paintings in particular. And once again, if we look at this, we know that this is a Madonna and Child, because the Virgin Mary is depicted in blue and red. We can also see this is meant to be John the Baptist over here, who is sometimes depicted as an infant as well. In this case, he's not actually pointed upwards, but his arm is situated upwards with the crucifix leading us in that direction. So it's a little bit different example there, but still, the triangle is usually used in religious context to echo the idea of the Trinity, as well as the solid stability of the church and of faith and all of that kind of thing. Now, we can also use triangles in a little bit different way. Here we can see a work that's using the same compositional format as that Saint Sebastian painting by Guido Reni, although being used for more action-oriented painting here, this time by Franz Snyder. Here we see dogs fighting in a wooded clearing, but we can see that there are four, distinct triangles that are being used to draw our attention throughout. And the major thrust being this kind of diagonal line, which draws our attention across the picture plane in this diagonal thrusting manner here. Now, aside from that, we can also talk about design. And design refers to the entire range of visual elements, the processes of organization, and the final product of that process. So there are 7 key elements of design that we'll be talking about today. And they are unity and variety, balance, emphasis and subordination, directional forces, contrast, repetition and rhythm, as well as scale and proportion. And so we'll see examples of all of these today. So we begin with unity, and unity refers to the appearance of coordination or oneness, the feeling that all the elements belong together, making up a coherent and harmonious whole. And so here we can see a work that utilizes unity quite extensively. Most artists are not going to utilize unity solely as it is. It tends to become static and boring when by itself. But here we can see an example of an artwork that utilizes unity quite heavily by Vasily Kandinsky. And the unifying factor in this would be the repetition of the circular form in this case. So fairly straightforward, fairly on the nose. However, most artists are going to utilize unity in much more complicated kinds of ways. So here we can see a very famous image I'm sure most of you have seen before. This is Hakusai's The Great Wave off the shore of Kanagawa, a very famous Japanese yukoi-e print, and we'll talk more about yukoi-e a little later on. But if we're looking at this, we can perhaps pull from it the unifying forms of the kind of shapes that he's using in the wave crests. Also, the kind of boat and human forms that we see throughout, as well as the use of color is a unifying factor. And so, but it is important to note that this particular example has much more variety than, say, this example, where the main variety is just the different size and different colors of the unified image. In this case, we have much more variety and only these much more subtle unifying elements. But we can also look at unity in different ways. So here we see our friend Van Gogh again, his arguably most famous painting, The Starry Night. But the unifying, kind of element within Van Gogh's work would definitely be his impasto brushstroke. And in this sense, the brushstroke especially, because it helps to create that kind of swirling pattern of different elements. Is this, wind? Is it a cloud? Whatnot. We also get that idea of the radiant light coming off of stars and the moon there and everything like that. So the brushstroke, as well as the color in this case, would be the unifying factors. Now, most artworks, however, are also going to utilize variety, and so they're going to utilize both of these things at once. And a good balance of the two, unity and variety, is what makes for a successful artwork. So variety acts to counter unity through diversity of elements. And so here we can see a nice example, straightforward example, that shows a great deal of unity and variety. And this would be Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe. And so we can see that the unifying factor in this particular image is the repeated image of Marilyn Monroe over and over again. However, the variety is the fact that each time the color palette changes. So once again, this is a little bit straightforward and on the nose kind of example, but it's pretty good example of the two going hand in hand. Likewise, we also have more complicated examples, such as this by Salvador Dali, or this is the Gala of the Spheres. And so this is a portrait of the artist's wife, but we can see that it's illusionistically created by all of these different spheres. So the unifying element would be all of the spheres. They're all roughly the same size as they recede into space. And then the variety factor would be that all of them are colored in differently and start to imply this kind of illusionistic mass of the portrait of the artist's wife there. But we can still have other works of art that utilize variety much more wholeheartedly than unity. So here we can see Vasily Kandinsky once again. And even though this particular work has unifying factors, the repetition of, a diagonal line and shape and other things, it's still much more varied than our previous example by, Vasily Kandinsky, which was all just circular forms. Now we have circular forms, triangular and rectilinear forms, and they're all kind of chaotically vying against one another. But likewise, we can also have extreme amounts of variety in much more realistic kinds of ways, such as in Salvador Dali's The Hallucinogenic Toreador here. And so we can perhaps see the repeated form of the Venus de Milo, which cuts back, which starts to create the illusion of the Toreador here in the center. And then we also have, other, kind of varied elements which create the illusion of a bull here, the arena, and all of these kinds of things. But once again, much more varied kind of artwork. Even more wildly varied than, say, Vasily Kandinsky's last one. Now, aside from unity and variety, we also have pattern. And pattern refers to the repetitive ordering of design elements. And not a lot of artists really use pattern wholeheartedly. It's usually a kind of subordinate element within a work of art, say like, a textile in the background or a tablecloth or someone's clothing, something like that. However, there are artists that deal with it more extensively. And one of my favorite artists of all time, as well as one artist that deals with this quite extensively, is Kehinde Wiley. And you might be familiar, he was commissioned to paint the official presidential portrait of Barack Obama a few years ago. But here we can see one of his earlier works. And what I find interesting about Kehinde Wiley, he's Nigerian by ancestry, but he goes around New York City and he approaches young African American men in contemporary urban style and everything, and he asks them to come back to his studio, and then he gives them art books, and he says, "Who do you want to be?" and they choose, and then he paints them as in the same posture as people represented in historical paintings. And I find it interesting because he's really commenting on the lack of, African Americans and African people in general within the context of a Western artistic canon. So, Western art history is very, European centric. And so he's kind of shining a spotlight on that whole idea by representing, contemporary young African American people in, the context of paintings that originally represented, kings and queens of Europe and things like that, other prominent individuals. But I've always found it to be rather interesting. But we can see that he's also using the pattern to echo this idea of fashion and all kinds of things like that. I love this particular one. This is Napoleon leading the army over the Alps after Jacques Louis David. But in this case, we have an individual in camo, and I love the fact that he's wearing the Timberland boots and everything like that. But we can see that, he's got that pattern in the background echoing this kind of royalty idea, but also echoing the kind of fashion idea within it as well. I always liked his stuff. If you ever get a chance to see one in person, they're really spectacular. This particular painting is life size, so that is, a full-size horse in the painting, very big, and everything like that. I also like that he's included in the original David painting, there are names of people who crossed the Alps. So we have, Hannibal, the Carthaginian general. We have Bonaparte. And then above there, we have Williams for this individual. I always found that to be an interesting little kind of funny moment within this painting as well. Once again, but using quite a bit of pattern in his work. Now, aside from Kehinde Wiley, we also have guys like M.C. Escher who also make quite a bit of use of pattern in his works like this, which he calls tessellation. And we saw a little bit of this last time with the figure ground reversal, but we can see the pattern being used over and over again in a lot of his work as well, such as we see here. But there are much more abstract ways that we can use pattern as well. And our friend Gustav Klimt, who we saw at the end of, two lectures back, also makes quite extensive use of pattern as well, but in a much more organic, abstract, geometric kind of way. So here we can see his very famous portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, but we can see that her dress is being made up of this recurring geometric patterning, and then the main part of her dress being made up of this kind of motif of the all-seeing eye within the triangle and everything like that. So once again, a little bit more abstract kind of use of patterning as opposed to geometric use of patterning like our previous two examples. However, we also have artworks like this. This is one of my personal favorite artists. You can follow this individual on Instagram. This is Marcus Akeson, but his work deals exclusively with pattern and almost eliminates the human form within that pattern. And one of the first time I ever saw this kind of painting and his paintings in general is one of those just absolute mind-blowing kind of moments of like, oh my God, how did you do this? But once again, using pattern quite extensively in that regard. And much more organic kinds of patterning as opposed to geometric kinds of patterning. Now, aside from pattern, we also have balance. And this refers to the achievement of equilibrium in which acting influences are held in check by opposing forces. And so balance usually plays out in one of two ways, and that would be through symmetry or asymmetry, or symmetrical balance and asymmetrical balance. So we'll see examples of that. So first and foremost, we have symmetrical balance, which is the near or exact matching of left and right sides of a work of art. And it's important to note that this is not really used in, fine art like painting and sculpture all that much. It's used much more in decoration and architecture, such as we see here. This is what's known as a rose window from Strasbourg Cathedral in France there. But we can see that almost all sides are completely symmetrically the same within this, down to even small, minute details. And so this is a major element of architecture and architectural design, more or less. We can see it somewhat in paintings and things like that, but once again, it's usually used for the architectural setting of the subject matter and things like that, such as in Da Vinci's Last Supper here. So even though the figures are kind of symmetrically balanced in their radiation out from the central figure of Jesus here, we can see that the architecture is the symmetrical element within this as well. But once again, symmetrical balance is really most heavily utilized in architecture because it provides a sense of solid stability, which is, kind of important in architecture in general. You don't want to be in a building that seems like it might fall down on you at any point. So here we can see that in the U.S. Capitol building, it's symmetrically balanced all the way down to flagpoles and individual elements on either side there. And once again, this is something that's used in architecture all over the world, all throughout time. Here we can see the Taj Mahal in India. This is also a major aspect of a lot of Islamic art and architecture as well, is an extreme use of symmetrical balance within the design work there. And so this falls into that category, and we'll see a lot more examples of that when we get to Islam a little bit later on as well. But once again, we can see all elements are echoed on either side. And this is, once again, something that's very, very common no matter where we're at. Here we can see the Palace of Versailles once again. So it's, kind of symmetrically balanced all throughout. And once again, this is used to echo the idea of power and stability and all of these kinds of ideas. Now, this is opposed to, say, asymmetrical balance, and this is when the left and right sides of a picture are not the same. Instead, visual elements are balanced according to size or meaning around implied centers of gravity. And so this is what's going to be used in painting and sculpture much more heavily. And so here we can see this is a rather extreme example of this, but here we have the Impressionist Edgar Degas and his Avant à la Ballet. So if we're looking at this, if we were to say take away the four figures of the ballerinas in the background over here, all of our focus would only be on these two, and we would have absolutely no reason to look at the entire left side of this painting. So Degas has masterfully balanced out our major focal point of these two ballerinas with the addition of these four on the left. So, and vice versa, if these two weren't here and the chair they're sitting on wasn't, we would have no reason to look at this half of the painting. So once again, this is a very kind of exaggerated example of that. It's usually much more subtle, such as we see in Jean-Baptiste Chardin or Simone Chardin's still life here. This is a basket of strawberries. But once again, if we were to take any one element away from this painting, it would utterly collapse. So if, let's say, we only had the basket of strawberries in the center, this would be a very boring, very static painting because all of our attention would be right there, dead in the center. We would have no reason to go all throughout. Instead, though, he's very masterfully and subtly balanced the center of the composition out with the addition of these smaller elements, which help to distract our attention away from the center. And so this would be a much more kind of basic or standard form of asymmetrical balance. However, we also have it utilized in a variety of ways. So here we see a nice example of the Impressionist Mary Cassatt and her picture or her painting Tea. But once again, if we were to remove any one of these elements, the entire composition would totally fall apart. So if we were to say take away the tea service here in the foreground, all of our attention would basically be on these two individuals, and we wouldn't have any reason to interact with this entire portion. Likewise, if the kind of vase up here on the mantle wasn't there, all of our attention would be right here. And so it's subtle little elements like that which help to distract us from the main focal point and help to draw our eye all throughout the composition. And this is what makes a successful work of art and a successful painting in particular, is the ability for the viewer to recognize all of these elements and to have our view drawn throughout the work and not solely focused on one pinpoint, if you will. Now, this also gets into several ideas of emphasis and things like that. So For our purposes, emphasis refers to or is used to draw attention to an area of an artwork, whereas the focal point is an area of emphasis on a specific point or figure position, contrast, color intensity, and or size that can be used to create emphasis. So emphasis and focal point usually go hand in hand. However, we also have areas of subordination, and that is the neutral areas of lesser interest that keep us from being distracted from the area of emphasis itself. And likewise, we also have directional forces, and these are paths for the eye to follow, provided by actual or implied lines that help to accentuate emphasis and draw the eye throughout the work of art. So we'll see a few examples of artworks, and we'll see how all of these play out. So here we can see what's known as the 3rd of May, 1808 by Francisco Goya. And this is referencing some of the atrocities committed in Spain by Napoleon's armies. But if we're looking at this, we can see that our emphasis is, or areas of emphasis are our areas of highlight. So our white areas here. However, our main focal point is the figure in white right here who's, making the dramatic gesture. And this is where all of our attention is being drawn to. And our attention is being drawn to this not only by the implied line of the light from the lantern here, but also the actual lines of the soldiers' rifles that are pointing at them there. So this is helping to draw our attention to this figure. Now, our areas of subordination would be like the figures of the slain down here, as well as the background, the soldiers and everything there. But these, once again, help to distract us and draw our attention away from the main focal point so that we don't get fixated solely on that. And it helps to create a more interesting picture. Now, likewise, we also have works like this. This is Theodore Géricault's The Wrath of the Medusa, and this is an actual event, just like our last painting from the Napoleonic War, in which this kind of French man-o'-war is sunk, and its survivors are, set adrift on this raft. And we can see the moment of high climax here where they've finally spotted a ship on the horizon. And it's very hard to see, but there's just this little tiny blip on the horizon right over here, and they're trying to wave it down. But once again, we can see that our area of emphasis would be up here on the guys trying to, hurl or hail the ship, and our directional force would be the implied line created by the mass of bodies undulating upwards to them. Now, we could also see this as having counter kind of directional forces in the mast of their raft, as well as the ropes, which are creating implied diagonals, which also help to distract us from the main diagonal thrust through the center of the canvas there. And then obviously our areas of emphasis or subordination would be like the background, the waves, some of these other figures here and there, things like that. But just another example, here we can see another famous painting from roughly the same time period, this time by Eugene Delacroix. Here we see Liberty Leading the People, and this is an allegorical scene meant to reference the Second French Revolution. If you ever saw the movie or read the book Les Miserables, this is set during the same time, or that is set during the same time period. But we can see once again that our emphasis or focal point is the allegorical figure of liberty here, who is rallying the French people to rise up and overthrow the restoration of the monarchy following the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte and everything like that. And our directional forces would be, once again, these diagonal thrusts that are leading us up into our focal point on Liberty there herself. Now, aside from that, we also have contrast, and this is referring to the juxtaposition of strongly dissimilar elements. And so we can have a variety of different kinds of contrast. We can have things like dark and light, such as our chiaroscuro. We can also have large and small, bright and dull, thick and thin brush strokes, geometric versus organic shapes, or hard or sharp, soft, blurred edges, things like this. So here we can see an example of a painting by Caravaggio that embodies a lot of these different kind of contrasting elements. So first and foremost, we have the contrast of chiaroscuro, extreme light and dark, in this case. We can also see the contrast between, the hard edge of steel and the soft quality of flesh in the sword held by David here. We can also see the contrast between, steel and fabric, as well as the contrast between youth and older age, life and death, and everything like this. What I find interesting about this painting, it's the only known self-portrait by Caravaggio. And Caravaggio has depicted himself as the severed head of Goliath here. And, in the story, David, hurls the rock at Goliath, kills him, and then he takes Goliath's massive sword and beheads him. And this was done in part by Caravaggio to offer pittance for some of his, exaggerated lifestyle. Caravaggio was known to get in a lot of trouble. He was threatened with excommunication from the Catholic Church multiple times by the Pope himself. So the Pope basically threatened him with eternal damnation. And as an apology, Caravaggio creates this painting to say that he was sorry and that he's, penitent for his sins and all of these kinds of things. But once again, we can see a variety of different contrasting elements within this. Now, opposed to contrast, we also have repetition. And this refers to the repeating of elements that gives a composition unity, continuity, flow, as well as emphasis. And so not a lot of artists really utilize pure repetition. However, it's much more common in abstract and non-objective art forms, such as Donald Judd's Untitled here. And he does many artworks like this, and it's really just the repeated form of this sheet metal and plastic box. And we would view it, and it would also interact with the wall and how light reflected on it and everything like that. But there's no real deeper meaning behind it. It's really just the simple repeated form of this kind of industrial-like apparatus, if you will. However, there are artists that use repetition quite extensively, and here we can see another example of Marilyn Monroe by Andy Warhol. And Warhol is using repetition in this case to really play up the idea of celebrity commodification. So if we're unfamiliar with Marilyn Monroe, she was, not only the first Playboy playmate, she was also an actress, a singer, a dancer. She was kind of a total package, if you will. She's also a model, all kinds of things like that. And so there would have been a time in America where it would have been hard to go anywhere without seeing her face on something. And so a lot of Andy Warhol's pop art work is really playing up this idea of the commodification of celebrity through the repetition of form, and that you see celebrities all over the place. I mean, I can't think of a day that I don't see at least one or two celebrities trying to sell something on television or, what have you. So it's a very ubiquitous factor in our experience. However, we can use repetition in much more subtle kinds of ways as well, such as in Grant Wood's American Gothic here. And this is a very famous painting, very heavily parodied painting, but I find it interesting in that we have the repetition of forms in this case. So in this case, we have the repetition of two forms. So we have the two spaces in between the pitchforks. We see that echoed in the overalls of the man. The two figures in general. Everything is in twos. Two windows side by side. Two buildings. All of these kinds of things. So we can use repetition in much more subtle kinds of ways as well. Now, opposed to repetition, we also have rhythm. And rhythm, in our sense, is any kind of movement or structure of dominant and subordinate elements in sequence. And so, in visual arts, rhythm is created through the regular reoccurrence of elements within or with related variations. So here we can see a nice example of this in Ogata Korin's screen painting of cranes. And so we can see that the crane form is echoed, but the rhythm comes from the fact that that two of them have altered their basic stance. So most of them are all pretty much the same, except we have the one with the downward head and the other that's kind of ducked down there. So these two elements create rhythm within the flow of these other elements as well. But we can also do rhythm in more complex kinds of ways, such as with Rene Magritte's Golconde here. And if we can see, we have the repetition of a self-portrait of Magritte himself. However, the rhythm comes in that each of the self-portraits is oriented differently. So, some of them are looking almost straight on at us, such as the guy here. Others are turned away, others are inside or profile or three-quarter views. So they're all kind of slightly turning, and this creates that idea of rhythm within this particular work of art. And once again, these two examples are much more on the nose than many works of art do deal with rhythm. It's usually much more subtle than this. But here we have another example. A lot of abstract work also deals heavily with rhythm, not only in form and whatnot, but also as subject. So Jackson Pollock here is very famous for using the rhythm of jazz and other musical forms as inspiration for his abstract work. But in this sense, we can see the rhythm is created through the repetition of these kind of, black lines that kind of sway throughout, as well as these, other kinds of colored elements and everything like this. So a little bit more abstract version of rhythm, if you will. Now, aside from rhythm, we also have scale, and this is the size relation of one thing to another. So obviously, the scale of a work of art is going to dramatically change how we view a work of art. So I think a lot of people are interested, or at least kind of shocked to know, that the Mona Lisa is actually a very small painting, comparatively speaking. So it's only about yay big. It's not very large at all. And because of the amount of people that go to see it, and the fact that you can only get within 5 feet, and it's behind glass, you really can't even get that close to the painting to really see it. And so this is what most people's view of the Mona Lisa really is. But once again, a smaller painting, we are, have to get closer up to it to see its details. And so it's going to dictate how we view it. Versus, say, the Coronation of Napoleon here by Jacques-Louis David, which is massive in scale. This painting is, if you can see by the person there in the foreground, this painting is at least 20 by 30 feet. It's very big. Each of these figures is larger than life size. So each of these guys is like 6 foot tall at least, and everything like this. So very, very massive in scale. And if we get up close to it, we can really only see tiny little details. We really have to stand back to take in all of it. So it's a painting that can only be viewed in a certain way and not like that of a smaller painting. And similarly, I like to show this just to show an idea of the scale of some of these paintings. Here we can see works by the French Baroque artist Nicolas Poussin, but we can see just how massive they are in scale compared to, say, a standard kind of portrait down here at the end, in which, we can get very close to, versus the large paintings where we have to kind of stand back away from it. Now, in addition to scale, we also have the idea of proportion, and this refers to the size relationship between parts of a whole. And what's interesting is that when proportion is done right, it's very pleasing, it's very harmonious, but when it's not done right, it's very glaringly obvious. But what I find interesting is that all of us have a certain level of proportion inherent in us. So for instance, based on our diagram here, the length between your eye, the two corners of your eye, is going to be about the same as the length between the two nostrils on your nose, and vice versa. The length between the bottom of your nose and the center of your eyes is going to be about the same as from the center of your eyes to the top of your forehead, and from the bottom of your nose to the under part of your lip, and everything like that. Now, obviously, there are some exceptions there, but generally speaking, this is going to kind of weigh in on all of us. And likewise, most of us are about 7 of our own head lengths in height. So if we were to, cut off our head and stack 7 of them up next to each other or on top of each other, they would all be about the same height as we are normally. However, here we have a nice example of when proportion doesn't really go right, or when it's right and when it's wrong. So here we can see two paintings that are done about 300 years separate from one another. On this, we have Ciembu's The Madonna del Castelfiorento. So here we have a Madonna and Child done during the medieval Gothic period. And then we have the same subject, which we saw earlier by Raphael, the Madonna del Prado. But once again, we can see that the proportions in Raphael's is much more accurate to reality, and so it makes it look much more realistic. Now, that's not to say that this artwork isn't, is intentionally not trying to be realistic. It's that at this time and under this aesthetic known as the Byzantine aesthetic, artists are encouraged to not be realistic so as to not be in competition with the divine creation and things like that. So figures tend to be exaggerated and elongated. I mean, if we look at the infant Jesus there, he definitely does not look like a baby so much compared to the one over here. But once again, these are coming out of different contexts. But we can see that without accurate proportion, it tends to look kind of weird and kind of stretched out and elongated versus, say, much more naturalistic. But another aspect of proportion, especially in historical artwork, is once again this idea of hierarchical scale. And so this refers to, the larger someone is depicted, the more important they are. So here we can see this is Duccio's The Maesta. And so we see the Virgin Mary and Child once again enthroned in heaven, and they're surrounded on all sides by holy figures, the apostles as well as angels. We can see our friend John the Baptist over here, once again pointing upwards, and he's kind of got the fur robe and everything. But we can see that the Madonna and Child, or the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus, are the most important figures, and they're depicted at least twice the size of everyone else. And so this is a way that artists have played with proportion as well to create interesting emphasis on specific figures and things like that. But this isn't anything new either. This definitely goes way, way back into history. Here we can see the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. This is the second or third emperor in the Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia. So this is roughly concurrent with ancient Egypt and everything like that. But we can see the king Naram Sin here is depicted twice the size of all of his foes that he's vanquishing in battle. And this is known as a Victory Stele. It's a large stone kind of signpost, if you will, that would have been erected on the edge of his kingdom so that anyone entering into the king or into the empire would know that, you do not oppose the law of the king. He is mighty. He is, victorious in battle and all of this. And this would all be indicated by our cuneiform writing, which we can also see over on the right there. But once again, this is something that's very, very common, and it's not just in Europe or Mesopotamia, it's also ancient Egypt and China, all over the world. Here we can see what's known as the Narmer palette. This depicts the first pharaoh, Narmer, who unites Upper and Lower Egypt into one unified kingdom for the first time. But once again, we can see the pharaoh, being the most important, is depicted twice life size. Then his kind of attendant is about half his size, and then the lesser important people are even smaller and everything like that. So once again, something that's very common. You'll see it all the time. Now that brings us to format, and that refers to the size and shape and thus the scale and proportion of an artwork. And so excuse me. This is strongly influenced or influences the total composition of a work of art or a piece, and changes in proportion have major impacts on the format of a work of art. So I want to show two works of art. They're the exact same subject, although they take different formats. So Here we can see Michelangelo's Pietà, and Pietà is a generic term which refers to any scene where the Virgin Mary is kind of holding the slain figure of Christ after he's been removed from the crucifix. So very, very common scene you'll see all the time. But what's interesting about this particular example is that in order for the Virgin Mary to actually be able to support this full-size 6 foot tall Jesus, and it is a 6 foot tall figure, she actually is much more massive than she would be in real life. So if she was to actually stand up, she would be over 10 feet tall, just to be able to support his full-grown figure the way that she is. But what's interesting, and this really shows Michelangelo's mastery and his genius, is that all of her extra bulk is hidden in her robes that we see down here underneath. That's actually supporting the figure of Christ there. So it's, once again, this is also, it's made out of marble, and it's kind of propped up, so we would only view it from kind of beneath it somewhat. And a lot of those things help to hide the kind of proportion issues that the sculpture has. Although it's kind of an illusion, if you will, to compensate for some of those things. But it creates a much more kind of unique and harmonious composition there. That is opposed to, say, this Pietà, and this is once again the exact same subject, although done about 200 years earlier, this time in the medieval period, coming out of Germany. And during the medieval period, a lot of their artwork is much more focused on the kind of grisly nature of Christ's death and his suffering and everything like that. So it has a much more gaunt kind of look. We can see the spear wound in his chest and the nail wounds in the stigmata in his hands and feet. We can also see that he looks to be emaciated, so it actually lends credence to how the Virgin Mary is actually able to hold him up in that sense. Think about if you've ever tried to pick up someone who's passed out drunk on the floor. Trying to pick up dead weight is not easy. And so once again, this is a little bit more realistic of how it would actually be possible. Although once again, this is a wooden sculpture, much smaller, so it takes on a different format than our much larger, two life size or larger marble, sculpture that we just saw. Now, just to end us off real quick, design summary. Finished works affect us because their design seems inevitable. However, this is not always the case. So I think a lot of people tend to think of, an artist like Michelangelo just goes and starts chiseling away at marble and he comes out with this masterpiece. Or, Caravaggio just sits down and starts painting. But that's not really the case. There's usually a lot of preparation work that goes into a work of art before it's committed in its final form. And so I wanted to show just a few examples. And many times artists will work through their ideas and sketches and drawings and things. They make alterations, and then these all inform what becomes the finished work of art. So a lot of these visual elements and these design principles are worked through in kind of smaller works of art that are not ever meant to be seen by the public or the viewer. Instead, they are kind of evolving into what becomes the finished product. And so here we can see one such drawing here, and then we can see two other drawings that were both made from life, from a menagerie, but both of these go on to inform Peter Paul Rubens' Daniel and the Lion's Den. And so if we look back, we can see the figure of Daniel has pretty much remained intact, especially the posture of his hands and bodies. It's really just his face that has changed somewhat here, but we can also see that those two lions are copied almost wholeheartedly from those drawings as well. So once again, it's something that we go through a variety of different kind of trial and error to create what becomes the inevitable finished painting or work of art and things like that. So that's where we'll end off for today, and next time we'll talk about interpreting artwork somewhat. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.